Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I am off to another trade show, this time down in Philadelphia, so I'm going to try and make this intro relatively quick. No podcast to record down there this time. I'll just be shuttling from hotel to convention center and back, maybe getting out for a meal or two, but I'm not complaining or anything, although I'm sure I will end up griping when the weather gets all swamp-like on Wednesday. I also booked my trip to L.A. and San Diego in June. There's a big biotech trade show in San Diego, so I'm going to spend a few days before then in L.A. Recording some shows, taking some Instax photos for my weird art book that I'm working on. And I'm also planning on taking the train down from L.A. to San Diego, which I've done once or twice before, and that is a route that might not survive climate change and erosion and such, but I figure last chance to see maybe. So I'll try and take some pics from that too. Oh, and I booked my hotel and registration for ReaderCon up in Boston this July, the Literary Science Fiction and Fantasy Festival. That always results in good talk, whether it's on or off mic. So anyway, all of that is just work, except for ReaderCon, which is fun. We are here for the opposite of work, so let's get to this week's conversation. My guest this time is Randy Fertel, who recently put out this fascinating new book called Winging It: Improv's Power and Peril in the Age of Trump. It's from Spring Publications, and it is, it's a sort of summation of Randy's 50 years of exploring the role of improvisation and spontaneity in the arts and in the polis. That is in our day-to-day lives as citizens, you know. And by improv, he doesn't just mean comedy, but instead it's this whole interdisciplinary world where that yes and response, that central edict of improv, gets internalized and helps break existing models of a whole lot of different things. And he's not talking about it just as a offshoot of improv comedy in the 20th century, but how it goes back to the history of mankind, or the history of life, really. Now, the subtitle of the book does make clear that this improvisation and spontaneity is not always a good thing. While the book explores all sorts of roots and examples of improvisation, along with a neuroscientific interpretation of it and what it means, Randy also gets into the dark side of improvisation as embodied by our former president here in the U.S. And throughout the book, Randy brings us a really wide range of examples of improvisation, and ranging from jazz to literature and poetry to science to painting to the development of messenger RNA to the musical Hamilton and the improv that went into the founding of America itself, not just the musical. It's a fun book in terms of drawing so many different areas of thought and trying to bring all these threads together and bringing the personal into it in the process. Yet he does this great job of sort of bringing all these threads together and weaving this bigger picture of what it means to be human, what it means to balance what he'll describe as hot cognition and cold cognition in one's day-to-day life. And throughout, the book does serve as a warning for what happens when we fall out of balance and embrace the intuition, the hot cognition of improv without stepping back and calculating and really trying to understand what we're feeling. Which is to say, when we listen too much to our gut and end up falling for the trickster, bad things can happen. Improvisation, he tells us, and he'll tell us during this conversation, is not good or bad, but it is an awfully powerful aspect of life. So Winging It is a fantastic book. I'm not beginning to do it justice here in terms of all the different areas that it covers. Didn't even go into the hallucinogen ego destruction area, which we get into in the conversation itself. But like I say, it's this book offers a framework for understanding who we are and how we create, whether that's art or any other aspect of our lives, and how we build on the past without just mindlessly replicating it. I enjoyed Winging It an awful lot, and I hope you'll give it a read. As caveats go, it is New York City, so there is street noise like cop sirens and stuff. Also, when I mention my writing on the encyclopedic novel, I accidentally say it took place at St. John's College. What I meant was Hampshire College, which I correct a sentence later. Also, we both semi-blank on the author of The Swerve, but it is Stephen Greenblatt. And there's also one big caveat, but I'll get into that when the conversation starts. Now, here's Randy's bio. Randy Fertel is a writer and philanthropist dedicated to the arts, education, New Orleans, and the environment. He holds a Ph.D. in English and American literature from Harvard University and is the author of A Taste for Chaos, The Art of Literary Improvisation, and The Gorilla Man and the Empress of Steak, a New Orleans family memoir. Randy has taught English at Harvard University, Tulane University, Lemoyne College, and the New School for Social Research. He specializes in the literature of the Vietnam War and the literature of exile. In addition to his writing, he is a president of the Fertel Foundation and the Ruth U. Fertel Foundation, named for his mother, Ruth Fertel, founder of Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. He lives in New Orleans and New York. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Randy Fertel. So one of the novelties about this episode is, for every other show I've ever done, there is and I'm holding up a notepad, a whole page of notes and prompts and such. I wrote down absolutely nothing for this one because my thought was, it's improvisation. We should have a conversation, and I shouldn't have any guardrails other than what's in my mind from your book and what comes up as we start talking. So consider this a very special episode of the Virtual Memories Show.
Well, in line with that, let me share with you that I've been, obsessed with improv for 50 years, and I've given many papers. And probably the most absurd thing you can do is read a paper on improv.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask about the whole challenge of writing a book, multiple books.
And I could tell some stories. But the main thing is that for this book, I decided I'm not going to give any papers. I'm going to have conversations. So my book launch was a conversation. I was at the Tennessee Women's Festival and made sure that the head of the English department at Tulane was in conversation with me. And so doing lots of podcasts, and really happy and excited to be doing this one.
We should mention, before we started recording, you mentioned my educational history, and I said I went to Hampshire as an undergrad. I actually went to Tulane for one semester.
Oh, no kidding.
Fall of '89, started there, wasn't drinking, realized really not the school for me to be in. It wasn't any AA type thing. I just had I'm too dramatic. And I just left for Hampshire and didn't take any drugs when I was there. So I've always been contrarian, I guess, when it comes to that stuff. But the sense of just being able to have a conversation about improv is what I think Winging It prompts. So well, we may as well start with the obvious question of your secret origin when it comes to improv and how it ended up becoming life consuming.
So it began with a prompt in a graduate seminar. I think the professor really didn't mean anything by it. It was just a throwaway line. We had read this obscure pamphlet from the Renaissance, Thomas Nash's Purse Penniless, Pierce or Purse Penniless, and which is a wild, free associative, very clever treatment of the fact that he's this clever and can do this off the cuff or seeming to, this free associative impromptu thing, and yet his purse is penniless, and Shakespeare is so rich, and so the professor said, "I bet you've never read anything like this before." And I thought, well, no, it's like Tristram Shandy and it's like Don Juan. Luckily, I didn't say anything because, it was a graduate seminar. They would have torn me apart because I couldn't have explained it, what the connections were. But it really intrigued me. And so I went in quest of the connection. And synchronistically, it was in that prompt. It was in, bet you've never seen anything like this before, because that's what an improvisation claims. It says, I'm not following any models. This is completely impromptu. And, it's you've never seen anything like this before. So I decided that spontaneity and improvisation were the best kind of hooks to use to explore that. So that became my dissertation, and which I call the rhetoric of spontaneity, because the first or the second thing you notice is that the claim of spontaneity, the first meaning is, listen, this is just fun. We're just having fun here.
Yeah.
Underneath that, it's a claim of authenticity. Because I'm not following models, you're getting the real me. So it's a claim of authenticity. It's a grabbing of authority. And so it's rhetorical. And that's the paradox of spontaneity, that it's rhetorical while claiming to be free of rhetoric. So that was my dissertation, and I kept working on it. I wanted to turn it into a book. And then I left teaching, went to work for my mother for 5 very long years, a whole nother story. And then went back to teaching, but along the way, it's like it wouldn't let me go. I would read like James Glick's The Chaos, the Making of a New Science, and I would get all excited, and then I'd realize, I'm excited because this helps me explain improv.
Yeah.
And so all these things would get woven into my net, trying to make sense of improv. So I became very interdisciplinary across the discourses, across the arts. And in 2015, when Donald Trump came down the golden escalator and I heard that first rant, I thought, man, I knew there was a dark side to improv, but I didn't know how dark it could get. And I had written this book, Taste for Chaos, which is a rather academic book, well written, I think, but it's
different audience, though. Yeah.
Different audience, and meant to change the way academia looks at improvisation. And as soon as I published it, I realized, what was I thinking? Academia is not going to change. So, that's a book that didn't find an audience. But I'm pleased with it. I make the case there that the Western canon, all these dead white men that we are throwing under the bus because they're so mainstream, in fact, started out on the outskirts. John Milton's Paradise Lost, which he claims is his unpremeditated verse, he's absolutely on the outside, a regicide. So Wordsworth, all those guys are trying to enter the canon, and they do, but we forget that. And so I'm arguing we shouldn't forget their beginnings in spontaneity and whatnot. So that book came out in 2015, and here comes Donald Trump, and I realized, man, I need to write a general audience book because this isn't too important to leave to the academics. So I started an improv conference in New Orleans across the disciplines, and then COVID came, and I had written a couple pieces about Donald Trump as improviser. And on the morning of Mardi Gras 2020, the voice that I've been looking for the general audience book came to me. It's those journalistic pieces I did on Trump as improviser. And so I had to decide, do I go to the St. Anne Parade and look for the Mardi Gras Indians, or do I stay home and get this started? And I stayed home, and that was the first super spreader event in history.
I was going to say, shortly after that, you had a lot of time on your hands to
80,000 infections.
Yeah.
And at 69, let's see, I was 70 at the time. I was not one to court COVID.
We didn't, I would say we didn't realize, but surely we sort of knew it was going to be not the place to have that sort of event.
We knew it was in the country, but we had no idea. Yeah. We had no idea in March of 2020. Yeah. So anyway, luckily I stayed home. And then, yes, it became my COVID project, and there was no FOMO. There was no fear of missing out. And I had just installed a standing desk, which is I highly recommend.
I have a adjustable one, a mechanical one that goes up and down.
I have an uplift adjustable one, and I never, almost have never lowered it. It works amazingly.
Well, as we said, I'm taller, as you put out here.
So it became my improv, my COVID project, and it's easily the only book I've written where I never entered a library. It was all online, or buying stuff online or looking stuff up. And I improvised. I like my improvisers. I just followed my nose. If this guy led me here, or to this idea, or to this book, I followed it, and I had a blast. I hope that comes through. I hope readers find it fun.
We'll say it has an improvisatory air. I'd say freewheeling as the vibe. How did it find a shape? Which is always the tension in anything when it comes to improvisation, and when you contrast it. This is me now ranting at length. Instead of the live performance aspect, when you talk about literary improvisation, there's still a shaping process that takes place after, an informing of the whole shebang, which we'll get to. How did this one find its form? My chairman
this is kind of an aside, but my chairman at the New School in Literary Studies read some early pages back in the aughts, and he's just dismissed it. He said, "Randy, you can't improvise a novel. How can you improvise a novel?" And he's missing the whole rhetorical feature. Jack Kerouac writes On the Road on a 130-foot scroll, and then submits it, and they say, "Well, we'll need to edit this." He said, "Oh no, this is the Holy Ghost." And he hits the street, if not the road. But then 6 years later, having edited it, he publishes it. And maybe it's not as spontaneous as the scroll. The scroll, in fact, was the fourth manuscript.
Yeah.
So which is the real On the Road? Well, it doesn't matter, because it has the impression of spontaneity. And it's that impression that has power or peril. And so shaping it, it begins with a very important epigraph from Oscar Wilde, that spontaneity is a meticulously prepared art. And so I needed to convey that rhetorical point. I knew that had to come in there. It's hard to say how I shaped it. I basically wrote a bunch of chapters and then moved them around until they worked. Another part of that story is that this was a 450-page manuscript, and I sat down with a book packager maybe in March of last year. And she said, well, Randy, what do you want to do with this? And I said, well, it has a political edge, and I need to get it out before the election. And she just laughed in my face. She said, Randy, it's 450 pages, but if we shorten it and focus it, we can get it published. So right there, we brainstormed a new outline, and that outline, I'm sure, got moved. The chapters got moved around, but usually it's hard to kill your darlings. But there was this whole other non-political piece to the book, which was about how what emerged in the writing of this long book was the realization that what I was describing was the emergence of global popular culture driven by improv. Yeah. Which, global popular culture is something new under the sun.
Sure.
Something we had never seen. There was the British Empire upon whom the sun never set, but there was no internet then.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this global popular culture is scarily something new under the sun. And so
that is a different book, though.
That's a different book, and that'll be the third in the trilogy.
That's what I was about to get to.
Yeah.
Make that the sequel.
And I'm very excited about it. And when I realized that if that's what I'm describing, then there must be a start date. When does global popular culture start? And historians are pretty much agreed that it's minstrelsy. And to talk about minstrelsy today is to get thrown under the PC bus. But in fact, we shouldn't do that, because in fact, minstrelsy started as a labor trope, not a race trope.
Yeah.
It changes and it gets, virulent. But it starts, it's a long story, which I won't tell.
We'll get to in the sequel.
But anyway, so this book came together rather quickly after that, and there is an arc to it, but it's hard to describe.
I'm with you, and I'll do my best in the introduction to it. But how much did growing up in New Orleans lead to a predilection for improvisation?
I've with 50 years of this, I've had plenty of time to reflect on how could one obsess about one thing for all these years. And clearly, New Orleans is part of it. New Orleans didn't invent improv. It invented, Louis Armstrong invented the jazz solo, improvisational solo, but it did bring improv overtly into popular culture. The word was used, and it wasn't in Jumpin' Jim Crow, for example. But so, grow up in New Orleans is really clearly part of it.
Not just
also,
for jazz, but
coming from the family that I did, with a very hyper-rational math sciences mother and a dad who was a little nutty, who ran for mayor on the platform the zoo needed a gorilla, and was happily known as the Gorilla Man for the rest of his life. So when I think about my obsession, clearly I'm trying to resolve that conflict between reason and unreason, or non-reason, and I think that's what improv's about. So that's the deep roots.
Yeah. For me, at least in my college version of it, it was Apollo and Dionysus.
Yeah.
For you, it's Apollo and Hermes, and Dionysus is seen as another example of
he's a darker, more extreme trickster.
Yeah.
And he's the Trumpian trickster.
And you did mention getting torn apart by other grad students, so you got your Dionysus, Euripides version in there too. But, But yeah, that to me, just where your literary roots come from in that respect, and how things started flourishing and branching out as much as they did is something I'm curious about. And then seeing how everything begins to tie together in non-overt structures. These irregular crystals that you form, in a sense.
Well, I'm older than you, and of that generation that was very influenced by Stern Tom Eliot and his great tradition.
I'm used to tough shit Eliot, but go on.
Tough shit Eliot. A man I have a very ambivalent relationship with, but his great tradition was, what I cut my teeth on. It was like, if you want to understand any text, you've got to understand the whole tradition and how it's a new version of that tradition. And I just bought that hook, line, and sinker. And I went to a little college in Florida where they had, like Hampshire College, a thing called Jefferson House, and you could improvise your own program. And I presented this proposal, which was basically warmed over T.S. Eliot, and they laughed at me. They said, "Randy, you can't do this. It's too big." Well, I did do it. It just took me 50 years.
My we'll say senior thesis, my Division II project at St. John's. Well, actually, it's the mid-years thing, your second and third years, was the encyclopedic novel, which also goes against what Hampshire was really for. Because I was sitting there thinking, yes, these are novels that were attempting to order information and the way we understand the universe.
Rabelais
and working with Joyce, Gaddis, Pynchon, people who were, as well as Diderot with the Encyclopedia Project. It was one of those things like, wow, intuitively, I managed to go completely against everything the school stands for. I somehow, just kept pursuing that sort of bent. But it's that sense of having to understand foundations before you can, even if you're trying to tear things down, understanding what they are first, as opposed to just having grievances.
But notice that improvisers, their premise, their volley, their opening volley is, I don't need to even look at the tradition. This is something totally fresh, de novo, and impromptu, and not looking at models, considering any decorum. But in fact, they are in conversation with that decorum that they're throwing under the bus. And
you think consciously, or
I think
that just informs them regardless of their intent?
We don't need to decide. It's both. Both possibilities. Yeah.
But yes, that sense that it's, again, in conversation, even when it's attempting to blow things up.
It's heteroglossic in back teens. Were
nice. Getting back to when I was 20 years old, which I like to be reminded of periodically. But
he's a big idea man for me.
Yeah.
I just mentioned him once in this book, I think.
Yeah, I don't recall him coming up particularly. Leaning on him, but who were the intellectual roots for you in that respect?
Kenneth Burke.
Yeah.
Rhetoric. Really smart rhetoric. Richard Lanham, another rhetorician, once head of the freshman English at UCLA, which at the time had a $3 million budget. Can you imagine? In an English department. Who wrote a book called Motives of Eloquence about Renaissance prose. And Stanley Fish, same thing. So even though I was a Romanicist, it was the Renaissance that first shaped it. Started with Thomas Nash, who's, Shakespearean era. So those are the ones that come to mind first.
And when you started to realize how, again, interdisciplinary things were, how you were looking beyond literature into various modes of performance, into those temporal forms, I guess, the ones that, are not on a page, that are going to dissipate before you.
Well, so I was in Cambridge in the 70s when I'm sure there must have been improv comedy clubs. but I was hidden away in Widener Library. I never found it. I got out to see the Neville brothers once and Randy Newman once, but otherwise, my nose was to the grindstone. So improv comedy was happening, and it becomes, in this book especially, a touchstone for understanding. Yes, and that idea of the rule of agreement, that you must respond to the call of your partner. And that becomes a template for all improv in my understanding of it. And when did that come into? So it's in the Taste for Chaos book. I reference it, but I really didn't know much about it. And then for this book, I read Sam Wasson's incredible book, Improv Nation. Really, it's like he interviewed everyone in that world. It's an amazing book, very long, very readable. Learned a lot from that. I took a class, UCB, enough to say that I'd taken a class.
I was going to ask whether there was a performing history for you or not.
No. I took another class recently, but that didn't work out. I needed to go back to New Orleans, but I need to do more of that. So Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton is a chapter in this book, and researching that, I learned about his Freestyle Love Supreme project, which is incredible. There are two documentaries about it, and really, really worth watching. And so I saw 3 performances of that. They're uneven, but man, he's just amazing how they do that. Anyway, so I've embraced comedic improv. I think it's really important. But like I said, you need, or I didn't quite say it, but if global popular culture is driven by improv, that certainly the 20th century is saturated in improv. You start with jazz, throw in a little Freud and Jung and free association, gospel, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, punk, all the reiterations of rock and roll. They're all more spontaneous than the last. Then comic improv is starts in the 50s, and before long it's the dominant voice. It's all those Christopher Guest, Spinal Tap, and Best of Show,
and everybody going nuts for Larry David in the
Larry
21st
David
century.
is apparently all improv.
Yeah, that's what I always heard was just we got a couple ideas for the scene, and
I was asked recently about Larry David's idea that he just starts with where the scene is going to end. And I
said,
it's funny.
Go on.
I said, well, far be it from me to argue with a billionaire, but in comic improv articulates it the other way around, that it's is where you start.
But that's
a prompt
for a stage performance, though, as opposed to something that's still intended to be a narrative.
TV maybe thing. That's why. Maybe that's why the difference.
But I was going to say, it puts me in mind of last year I did a session with Bill Griffith on his biography of Ernie Bushmiller, the guy who made Nancy, the comic strip. And Bushmiller, he would start with the punchline panel, which could be a water pistol that's been run over by a steamroller, and you'll have to go back and figure out what the 2 or 3 panels were that lead up to it, because he would have the kicker and just have to invent the scenario that led to an incredibly absurd conclusion, starting with the absurd conclusion. And I wouldn't say an improv guy. Everything is hyper focused and crafted in a sense, and yet he's still starting with the germ of the this image is funny. Let's figure out how it happened, and constructs in that way.
There's a moment in Ulysses. Sorry to go from.
Oh no, please! This is the high and high.
Yeah. But there's a moment during Ulysses, Stephen Dallas is wandering around Dublin, and he keeps remembering this joke that he heard when he was a student in Paris. And all we hear is the punchline. And we can figure out the rest of the joke from the punchline. The punchline is, "C'était le pigeon, Joseph." It was the pigeon, Joseph. No, I didn't fool around.
Yeah.
It was,
That pigeon brought it. Yeah.
So from the ridiculous to the more ridiculous.
I was going to say, it's not high and low. It's more high and weirdly high. But,
that's one of the places this work starts, that, throwing out high and low, that whole distinction is.
As someone who comes in from the cartooning side of things, that's always been we've always been treated as a degraded art form. It's like, no, it's just as valid as anything else. Do
you know that book, that big format book? Oh, I left it in New Orleans. High and Low, Adam Gopnik and some other guys.
I didn't see it.
It's really good. And there's a chapter on graffiti written by Adam Gopnik, who is, God, he's so brilliant. And he actually, I have it in my notes here, everything he says about graffiti could be said about improv.
I'll let you refer to notes in this one, even though I'm going without. But
well, I can't quote all this from memory. So graffiti is sprawling. It has sprawling, messy vitality. It knows and violates specific decorums. It seeks to bust up stale conventions. It confronts life more directly. I mean, everything he says in the list is 3 times as long. Yeah. I could have had a chapter, and I probably will have a chapter in the next book on graffiti. It's amazing, and then it climbs to the level of Basquiat, right?
I was going to say, it was a block or two from here I recorded my Keith Haring episode with Brad Gooch, and that's exactly where he was coming from. It was a line that Brad had, that Warhol took the everyday up into art, and Haring took art down to the back into the everyday with the murals, with especially the stuff he was doing in the subways that was deliberately temporary, things that would just get torn off the advertising sheets he would draw on. But it's.
Well, I didn't listen to that when I saw the title, and I wondered, so how is Haring an improviser? I mean, his stuff is so tight.
There was no plan.
There was no plan.
Those murals, he would just stand. Some of them he would have to submit a little diagram for, but most of them he would just start on one side and finish. He would just go and go on the bigger stuff. And the other things,
I need to listen to that.
Yeah, to me, it was absolutely not knowing what those processes were like. Yeah. It was just, you went in there with just, this is the wall they're giving me. I'm going to fill it over the next 12 hours and it's done. And that's again, part of how, for me, everything in my life is tied together by various guests and their books and other projects. Yeah. So seeing resonances and winging it to things like that is good.
Do you know the story about Pollock, Jackson Pollock? Someone was fussing that, a kid could do this. And Pollock took a stick, put it in a jar of paint, picked it up, threw a blob onto a doorknob 10 feet away. He said, could a kid do that? QED.
And the other thing, yes, and puts me in mind of, because again, everything in my world is podcast associations. Bruce J. Friedman, the author, I recorded with 10 years ago, 2014. And he talked about one of his modes for short stories was the what if. In his case, something happened on the street and I wwent back and thought, what if this happened instead? Or what if the guy, decided to ask me to do something for him? And an entire career spins out of that. The stories would just result from
hypotheticals.
Yeah. And in the what if I was the person who did say yes? You know, what if his example of it, he ended up doing a short story that got adapted into a terrible Dan Aykroyd movie, Dr. Detroit. Basically, he's at an Indian restaurant and a pimp sits down with a girl at the next table, and the pimp is clearly having difficulty figuring out what the hell to order on the menu because he's never been in an Indian restaurant. And Bruce just kind of leans over and, you know, I always go with this. When the girl heads off to the bathroom, the pimp turns to him and says, you know, thanks, man, you saved me. I'm trying to bring this girl into my stable. And if I looked embarrassing here, not knowing what to order, that's bad. So you really did me a solid. And in the story, you know, the professor gives the pimp his card, and the pimp ends up calling him saying, hey, man, I'm just about to get busted. I need you to run my stable for a while. And this is what turned into the story, into the movie. And it's all just Bruce that evening thinking, you know, what if this little moment turned into something else? And I said, yes, I'll do that. And that turns into, again, short story, bad movie, et cetera. But the willingness to just look a little past whatever the situation is and what it could be, you know? But anyway, that's, you know, again, all the oddball associations I make, you know, reading your book about all these associations we make and build.
Well, the critical endeavor is not what if, but so what?
Yeah.
You know, if this is what I see, what's the implications of that? You know, what is that? How is that trying to shape my response to itself and to life? And I was another surprise. I guess around 2010, I discovered this group in Canada, the Institute of Improvisational Critical Studies or something like that. And that idea, that critical study of improvisation, I had never used that term, and I realized, that's exactly what I'm doing. But, you know, I read their stuff and they seem to leave out the critical part. It's a bunch of people who, you know, have their interest in this kind of improv or that kind of improv, or maybe two or three, but they never ask the big critical question. How do all these fit together? How is this a field, not just a bunch of rows, but a field with something happening that's always the same? So, you know, essentialism isn't well received these days, but that's what I'm going for. I want to find what is the essence of improv, and I think the essence is disruption. It's a pushback against decorum.
For something that you give we'll say neuroscientific background for. Actually, can you go into that a little bit in terms of the neuroscience? So
that was another lovely surprise. I had a little bit of neuroscience in the Taste for Chaos book, but I did a lot more for this one and discovered Antonio Damasio, who's this rock star from USC, a neuroscientist who traces the beginnings of life from single-cell bacteria, and it's all an improvisation. Life is an improvisation. And where it ends is in two kinds of attention, two kinds of mind within our brain. One is what Daniel Kahneman calls fast thinking, and the other is slow thinking. It's hot cognition and it's cold cognition. It's Einstein, I'm going to quote again from my notes, who says, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. So Einstein, you know, is this hyper-rational guy who knows that it comes up from below, that, you know, embodied emotion and archetypes or who knows what. It's not all reason, and he wants to combine those two. Well, in fact, the hot and cold cognition are in a battle, just like he says. They're in a battle, and neuroscientists have put their finger on how it is that the sacred gift gets forgotten, because there's a connector between left and right hemispheres. And these kinds of cognition aren't hemispherically determined, but there's a leaning that way.
When we had the whole right brain, left brain thing back in the 80s, but it's kind of been dismissed.
That's been dismissed, but still, it's a good metaphor at least. And anyway, so there's a connector between the two hemispheres, and it's called the corpus callosum at the base of the brain. And the cold cognition, the left hemisphere, has control over that highway. That they're supposed to be communicating, so hot cognition is what you use when the saber-toothed tiger comes through the bamboo break. You're running even before you think run, because your body, the endorphins, the adrenaline, it's all pumping before you can think tiger. Cold cognition says, there are no saber-toothed tigers. That can't be a saber-toothed tiger. There was none here yesterday, because it's the predictive function. And it's saying, do this because this is the way it's been. And so cold cognition in this regard gets awarded the Darwin Award because he's dead. So the idea would be for hot and cold to work together. And in fact, I think that's what the great improvs are doing. They're bringing the two together. But then, there's the dark version, which is Donald Trump or Kubla Khan, Coleridge's Kubla Khan, where he says, weave a circle round him thrice, for he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. Trump takes that to a whole new level. It's pure hot cognition. He's free associating it's shtick, but it's, every time he leaves the prompter, he's saying, nah, I don't need that. You don't need to think. Just, if I can do it without thinking, why should you? That Laura Trump, his daughter-in-law, has come out with this album, which has the lead song is, Don't Think, Just Jump. And I think in that, she's the perfect surrogate for her father-in-law, because that's basically what he's saying. Don't think, just jump. I'm going to agitate your fear and anger, just as social media and AI does. And that's good enough for now. And let's go with that and follow me into the end of democracy.
And as
what could go wrong?
Again, as we saw 4 years ago, just about now, the idea that someone took global pandemic as this is my opportunity to stand in front of a camera for 3 to 4 hours a day just riffing, and you end up with bleach. If we find a way to inject bleach into the veins, that'll get rid of it, because just trying to come up with something to say to see what resonates and what doesn't.
Yeah. And of course it's shtick, and no one will accuse him of being the next Robin Williams. He's no great improviser, but he does have the improviser's superpower, which is he's a good listener. He doesn't listen. He won't listen to you or me or to the grown-ups in the room, but he does listen to his base in the sense that he's looking for feedback. And, it's apparently generally recognized that the whole idea of the wall came from his handlers warning him to talk about immigration in a speech. And I don't know if they put a little iconic wall or something, but anyway, he reified the wall. It became the premise. And he said, well, we're going to build a wall. And they went wild.
Right.
And, he's a narcissist. He needs feedback, constant feedback. And so it became a bigger and bigger idea, and then it became the soul plank in it, or not quite the Gorilla Man's soul plank, but almost the soul plank in his platform, and then it became White House policy, and so it started with an improvisation, unquestionably. So there's danger in them hills,
Yeah. How do you? How do you look at it in those terms then, in terms of, we'll say cultivating good improvisation or hot cognition, or is it on the responsibility of the audiences to be colder in a sense?
Yeah. That's my first step is we need to put our finger on the power of this gesture. We need to understand how deep it is in our bioevolution, in our neuroscience, in our kinds of attention. And, hot cognition, the gesture of spontaneity activates the fear and anger, which, rules us so completely these days on social media. And so when someone says, hey, my gut knows more than many brains, my hope is that people will think, that doesn't sound trustworthy. Maybe I should watch my wallet. Maybe I should watch my freedoms. Maybe this will lead us down a road to the end of democracy. Let's, remember cold cognition for a change and give it some thought. So that's my first. And then, people ask me, so what's the good improv? And Biden demonstrated some good improv during the State of the Union, both this last one, but especially the one before, when clearly his handlers had prepared him to do this. It's a meticulously prepared art. But he brought up the Republicans' plan to sundown Social Security, Medicare. It would have to be voted on every 5 years. And he announced this, and he knew they were going to rise to that bait. And sure enough, the hecklers started, and who was the loudest? Marjorie Taylor Greene. So he said he had the comeback already. He said, "Oh, that's great to hear. So you're not in favor of getting rid of Medicare? Okay, well, I'll count on your vote." And he did pretty much the same thing again, and they rose to the bait again. But the first one was really effective. So that, I don't think that because we've had this dark improviser that we need to turn our backs on improv. Improv is part of life. This conversation, like you said from the beginning, is improv. Improv is in everything we do. And we need to understand how it works and how it can go too far. And, but it's, it's the roots of all the innovation and creativity in the world. So let's not throw it under the bus.
Yeah. What have you learned from the conferences you were hosting? And have you gone back to in-person?
Not yet. Okay. Not yet. Well, we were working on to do one in Paris. Mm-hmm. Macron visited New Orleans and invited us to develop some cultural exchange. So I rose my hand, not to him, later, talking to some of the people who were at that event. And I said, well, how about an improv conference? So we worked on that. They wanted to do it right before the Olympics. I thought, man, that's crazy. And sure enough, the government said, no, that place that you want to put it.
Turns out we're locking the city down.
Yeah, so we're looking at next year. So the next one might be in Paris, 2025. But what I learned from the first ones, we had some great panels. And it was interdisciplinary. We had Mel Chin, who had just done that augmented reality piece in Times Square. We had Jules Pfeiffer, who didn't come. He wasn't well enough. But we had Michael Tisserand, who's a great cartoon historian.
Trust me, I drove out to the end of Long Island to sit down with Jules for one of these. That's
when
I pitched him. He was, you'd have to come out to Long Island. I'm like, yeah, you're Jules fucking Pfeiffer. I'll get in a car anywhere.
Oh, yeah. We came up from New Orleans.
Yeah.
And, we interviewed him for 4 hours.
Yeah.
And in 4 hours, at 92, I think, at the time, he had trouble with, I think, 4 names. Now, in the course of this hour long, I'll probably not remember 10. And of those 4, he recalled 3 within a minute. The mind is incredible. And apparently he's doing a cartoon a day upstate. He's amazing. And he totally identifies with improv. You know, it was when he discovered Mike Nichols and Elaine May in Chicago, and he said, God, they're doing just what I'm doing, but they don't have a net. Yeah. I can just start a new cartoon.
And that's what I was getting at, that what's on the page versus what's on the stage. Yeah. Whether it's improv comedy or jazz, the things that are, you have to capture them instantly on the fly and understand what the audience's vibe is, as opposed to something where, again, there's a little more the ability to correct, I guess.
Well, it helps that one of the rules of improv is there are no mistakes.
Yeah.
So Herbie Hancock tells a story about playing with Miles in Sweden, and he's supposed to be handing off his solo to Miles, and he ends on just a terrible note. He calls it a rotten fruit hanging out there. And Miles gives him a look, gives him the side eye, and then he starts his improv and turns his rotten fruit into gold. Yeah. And Herbie Hancock says, what is this alchemy? And my answer is, it's the alchemy of yes and the alchemy of there are no mistakes. Because, you know, if I say, you seem to be out of breath, you can say, yeah, I have asthma. Or you can say, well, yeah, there's an ogre chasing me. So the ogre is a mistake in the sense that there are no ogres, right? It's not real. Yeah. It's a lie. See how lies are intrinsic to improv. And the Trump told 30,000 of them in 4 years. So it's in a sense a mistake, but it's much more interesting than I have asthma. And it's the beginning of a narrative, which is what comic improv does. It builds narratives.
But yeah, I was thinking again of the conferences, and you have your story with Michael Pollan and
Mark Plotkin.
Yes, and your attempt at we'll say sympathizing with the subject matter by taking a massive amount of hallucinogens a few days in advance, or in advance of the conference.
So here's the thing. So improv claims to be totally impromptu, but there's kind of a wink there. It's not a total commitment, and it's a meticulously prepared art, and it says, listen, this is going to be totally direct experience, unmediated by decorum or models, but it's in conversation with those models. So improv, there's an ironic quality to improv that's intrinsic, and it's winking all the time, which actually keeps it much more real than the improvisers who. Anyway, so... Or
like Breton, when he was insisting automatic writing is the only form. It's like, okay, but it gets really tiresome after a while. So, we need something that's... Taking drugs.
Sorry?
Taking drugs.
So, So I started reading Pollan's book. I'm got a food background, so I've been reading him for a long time. And basically, he's describing this unmediated experience. The death of the ego, the opening of the faucet of experience, so that you've got all this raw data coming into your experience. So I thought, man, I've got to try this. I'm a child of the '60s, so I'd done some hallucinogens, but never the heroic doses that they take now, and which leads to this death of the ego. So, I got a guide, and I got some hallucinogens, and I took it, and I'm not sure what happened, but I was just nauseated for 4 hours. It was awful, and it's hard to be free of your ego when you're nauseated. So I went into that conversation with Pollan and Plotkin kind of shorthanded. But they were great. They were, God, Pollan is so smart and so well spoken, and Plotkin's a blast. So he's an old friend, New Orleans friend.
Yeah, the chapter I found really affecting. I have no hallucinogen experience of my own except for maybe how I approach the world in general. But it did remind me of the anecdote that a neuropsych guy told me back in college about when they dosed spiders on acid.
I know spider webs got very weird.
Yeah, they got very intricate. They worked really, really hard, and the webs were completely unfunctional, but they seemed really happy with what they made. They're like, yes, I finished, and it's a completely wrong shape of web, and nothing actually works. But yeah, they, I don't know how you figure out the optimal dose for a spider given the size of their nervous systems, but, somehow these neuropsych guys figured it out. But talk about cultivating hot cognition and improv. Like what do you find as how to embrace it, I guess, how to make sure you're not being overly rigid while still, not falling for the negatives of improv.
Well, so neuroscientifically, improv comes out of the salient network, which is when all that information comes into, the faucet is opened and all that, what jumps out at you is the stuff that's going to be meaningful, the salient stuff. The salient mode is different from the default mode network, the DMN, which is just recently discovered. And it's basically the ego. It's basically that self which ruminates, when you're not really, it's not the prefrontal cortex, it's not you're thinking hard, you're just kind of, boy, I really screwed that up. Oh, I can't do that because I'll just screw it up again. So it's this ruminative, negative, and Pollan describes it as going down a perfect powder ski slope, but there's a trail, and instead of going into the fresh snow, you're going down the tried and true trail. And so the answer is that you got to get out of the default mode network. And during that conversation, I kept saying, God, how do we get out of this? How do we get out of it? So
without taking so much drugs that you're nauseous for. Yeah.
Well, it's the beginnings is getting free of your ego, which, how do you do that? You need ego strength to be free of ego. So,
like you say, there's an irony and a winking throughout.
Yeah.
What have you been reading lately that's, in the literature, as it were? Or what have you been reading lately, which you may know is one of my favorite questions to ask guests?
Well, I came up yesterday from New Orleans, left Jazz Fest, and the plane was late, so I didn't get to go to see Uncle Vanya at Lincoln Center, but I did get to read it on the plane. Oh, my God. I had never read it. How could I not have read it? It was really great. He's really brilliant. And this early ecologist, environmentalist. So what have I been reading? I've been reading Demon Copperhead, the wonderful book by Barbara Kingsolver. Mm-hmm. And as I read it, I thought, I probably should go back and reread David Copperfield before I read this. A novel that I love and that I've taught. But Demon Copperhead was so much fun that I just kept going. And then I absolutely loved it. It's amazing. And then I dutifully went back to David Copperfield and was amazed to find that, having just finished Kingsolver, Dickens was boring. Can you imagine? Boring. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say that, but it was true. And then I read a book that I'd heard for years. I had to read her Poisonwood Bible about
I've heard it's great.
The Congo. Yeah. And I'd never read it. And it's so great. I had no idea how brilliant it was. She's just amazing. So I'm on a Barbara Kingsolver kick. And I find that getting lost in a novel is the surest way to recenter myself. I'm just a born lit guy.
Yeah.
I was the guy in high school that was always reading, but never what was on the syllabus.
Oh yeah, no. There are many ways in which you and I are on the same page.
Yeah. So I graduated 17th from the bottom in my magnet school, and so I was a slow starter. I was a late comer to any success.
I'll tell you my funny version of this. My sophomore year English teacher assigning novels for term papers, and there's a whole list, and people are supposed to pick, and then he'll yes or no. And I decided to go off the list. I asked him, my mom's always had this copy of Somerset Maugham's Razor's Edge, do that. And this man looks at 16-year-old Gil in 1987 and says, no, I think you want to read Catcher in the Rye, Gil. Yeah. Reading it and then finding out all the later context post-Salinger, it's boy, what was Rocco thinking when he assigned that? Did he have some idea that I was, going in a certain direction with life, or potentially Mark David Chapmaning? It was one of those. I really want to do this. Mom's like, no, Gil, you want to do Catcher in the Rye. I'm like, well, I guess you've identified the student in your class each time around. But yes, so I was coming up on science fiction and again, the comic books and all that stuff before moving into, weirdly enough, literature that, I discovered Dante through the X-Men. Like there was an issue of the X-Men where they basically built a parallel to the Inferno. And I should read this at 11. This was where I was making my literary connections at the time. But yeah, we kind of free associate.
So speaking of Marvel, I had this important moment in during COVID. I guess during one of those breaks in COVID, I was having lunch with Gwen Tompkins, who has this great music interview show on WWNO in New Orleans called Music Inside Out. And I was in a funk. I said, Gwen, I'm trying to write this general audience book, but I want to talk about archetypes. I want to talk about Hermes and Trickster. And she said, Randy, look at Joseph Campbell. Look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's all archetypes. That's your springboard. Yeah. And that's what I did. And that, I don't know if I persuaded people that Trickster is part of our life, which I think he is. But it helped me over that hurdle.
I grew up as a Marvel kid. I will say, again, my immediate jump would be that actually the DC comics would work more in the archetypes, largely because you simply get the Batman and the Joker thing, and you get the Trickster and how destructive ultimately it can get.
You've got Loki, and you've got Wanda. And
that holds up too, But yeah, it's I think those characters. That's why the DC characters are less interesting to me than the Marvel ones, because they had less humanity to them.
Yeah, I started with DC and moved to Marvel.
Yeah, I was coming up in the 70s, so the DC comics at the time were just god awful.
Yeah, right.
So that's why I'm trying to work on a piece about Counter Earth for the next issue of Haiku for Business Travelers, and have to admit that it wasn't Socrates, and earlier it was Fantastic Four 173 that turned me on to Counter Earth and the whole concept of things behind the sun, I guess, but which is a Nick Drake reference. I go all over the place too with this stuff. So you're considering the sequel, or are you holding out until we know what happens in November 24?
I'm doing a little work for the sequel. But, I'm just doing podcast after podcast and book event after book event. I have one coming up here in New York on June 13th at the Lotus Club, starting at 5:30. One in New Orleans earlier on May 20th. A conversation with Beth Ann Fennelly, who was one of my editors, and I had a whole tribe of editors. It takes a village, and she came to it when I was changing it from 450 pages to 200 pages, and she probably had more shaping effect on the book than anyone. And she's a brilliant poet, really fun. And we're going to have a great conversation at Octavia Bookstore on May 20th. So a lot coming up. Sherry Turkle at Harvard Bookstore. I'm not sure when. Davia Nelson at City Lights in San Francisco. Davia is one of the Kitchen Sisters and an old friend. So, like I said, I'm not doing talks. I'm not doing papers. I'm doing conversations. So a lot going on.
The one, we'll say, philosophic literary reference that I was crushed not to see at any point in the book, Lucretius.
Well, he figures in Taste for Chaos, which I have.
Oh, good. Okay, yeah. So you've already treated the swerve.
And the whole swerve is and there's no explanation for the swerve. It just happens.
Yeah.
An
atom says yes and goes off and does its own thing and everything.
Yeah. And though he throws the gods under the bus, nonetheless, it's all inspired by Venus, by love.
Yeah. The law of attraction.
Yeah. And there's an index here, and you can look up Lucretius. Yeah, he's a major, and that incredible book, The Swerve.
Yeah, I haven't read it. That was a Greenblatt, or
it's really good. What's his name?
I want to say Greenblatt, but it's not him.
Yeah, I think it is
Stephen Greenblatt.
Stephen Greenblatt. I think it's that.
Yeah, I always screw this up because it's another one, and I'm going to come off as anti-Semitic, even though I'm a Jew. If I mention another Jewish name, that turns out to be it.
Right.
So, but I'll put that in the notes afterwards.
Imagine a New York Times bestseller about a 15th century monk who discovers a manuscript about a 2nd century philosopher. Yeah, it's an amazing book. Great read. He's brilliant. He's part of that Renaissance tribe that was a big influence.
Yeah, I should ask before we break up, that literary tradition for you, when did that take hold? You had the Renaissance, you had the Romantic, the things you were studying in grad school, basically, before you started expanding your mind into all the good stuff. What was the root of that? Do you remember, a particular piece of writing that grabbed you and sent you down this path? Or a teacher.
The book that I've never managed to work into my writing, but I had a seminar on Flaubert and Stendhal. Stendhal's Red and the Black is there's this galloping pace to it. There's no kind of overt claim of spontaneity, but it's just riddled with the feel of it. And Flaubert, the master, who reads 30 books to write one page, and writes one page a day. That contrast kind of got me thinking about spontaneity. The book, which was really the trigger, was Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus. I read that when I was a student in Paris, a phrase I love to say, falls out of my mouth very easily. And but I read it, and I hadn't quite found the this was before that graduate seminar. I hadn't found the language that helped me understand the issue, but it's about this composer who, is a master of the tradition, and he's a master of rational composing. and but he wants this breakthrough. And it's a brilliant novel with many levels, including a satire of or ironic treatment of the Nazi regime. But he's longing for this breakthrough, and he makes a pact with the devil to achieve it. And the pact is consummated by getting syphilis, and he, in his illness, he makes that breakthrough. So that's not a very appetizing introduction to the book, but in it, the book is about this conflict between composed and freedom from composition, and so that really was a springboard. And oddly enough, I wrote a paper about it in my senior year of college. And when I was finishing my dissertation in 80, about, I needed a conclusion. And then I thought, oh, I know. I'll use that paper from 1972. And so that's, quite a through line. And then when I was doing Taste for Chaos, Taste for Chaos has this methodology. Half the book is about, how do we talk about spontaneity? And then a series of century by century examples of this, and I came to the 20th century, and it was like, God, there's so many possibilities. What do I do? And so for the first time, instead of one example, I used three. I used Jung's The Red Book, which had just become public, and Joyce's Ulysses, and Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, which is quite an undertaking. And I think I pulled it off. And so I, again, used pages from my senior essay in this book 45 years later. I mean, that's pretty amazing. I actually submitted to Guinness. I said, there was got to be a category for a project that took the longest. They ignored me. But
unofficially, though,
yeah,
you win. Besides Jean-Baptiste, favorite Jazz Fest performer? Or do you have something you particularly enjoyed this year?
Let me tell you about Jean-Baptiste.
Yeah.
His performance last year at Jazz Fest was, I was saying, was the best ever. That last album, I think, or I don't know which album, but the one he won the Grammy for, he used the St. Aug's Marching 100, which is the purple and gold marching band from this Creole black Catholic school where he went. And he had them on the stage at the New Orleans Jazz Fest. And he's a master of playing an audience. And he knew it was his audience. It was his New Orleans audience. So he had St. Aug's band, and he just went to the hill. This year, he had Preservation Hall up there. He had all kinds of great guys. But I had just seen him at the Beacon here, and it was pretty much the same set, except there was this interlude in the middle where he went to the piano. He plays every instrument, and he just demonstrates it on stage, each one, and dances and sings. But he went to the piano, I think the first time in the concert. Maybe there was another. But anyway, he goes to a grand piano, and he starts playing Gotcha, the 19th century Creole, who wrote Bambula and other important early classical, pre-jazz New Orleans stuff. And then switches to Professor Longhair, and then all these amazing links, and it was absolutely brilliant. And then he got back to the Beacon set. It was really great. There was this incredible Facebook post that he reposted from a guy named Burwell, and it explained that interlude thing that helped me explain it just now.
Is it Carter Burwell, the composer?
Think.
Okay, he's the guy who does the music for the Coen Brothers movies, and that's the only reason I know the name. Movies. Miller's Crossing is my all-time favorite.
Yeah,
so
that's set in New Orleans.
Yes,
yeah. A friend of mine was the what do you call it? The person who found where to shoot everything.
The location scout.
Location scout. Yeah. And she says that New Orleans is great for film because there's so many periods. Yeah. You know, there's deco and there's arts and crafts and there's, you know, whichever decade you're looking for, you can find it.
Right. I should ask, as a last question goes, my wife's family is from Louisiana, about 45 minutes outside New Orleans. We had our wedding 6 months after the storm, actually, March of 2006. We were down in the city about 6 weeks after to see if the venue was still there and everything else. And we helped stimulate the local economy by having everybody get annihilated the night before the wedding. When we talk about improv, to me, there's the sense of emergent principles also, where people just, I'll put it this way, coming off the highway by the Superdome and there are no traffic lights that work, but there aren't wrecked cars everywhere. People are figuring out how to go and not go. That held up for quite a while also. There were multiple visits where we're like, they still haven't brought power back. That's kind of disturbing because as cities go, it would be nice to actually have something that was hospitable to human population. But that sense of that city in particular, we'll say being able to weather the storm, the people who came back and were able to figure out a way to live in the face of, we'll say, abandonment by the rest of the country. Tell me about your New Orleans, I guess, and your post-Katrina New Orleans, if it's something you can talk about as an addition to this.
There's so many ways to respond to that. Rebecca, who's the great San Francisco writer, Rebecca.
Rebecca Solnit.
Solnit, thanks. Yeah. And her final chapter is about Katrina. And one of the things she says, what she's arguing is that people rise to the occasion. And the right wants to say this is the time to crack down because people are, the worst.
Improvising.
Yeah. They're stealing and, shoot to kill and all that. But, she has all these instances of the improvisations which are absolutely positive. So for example, there's this thing that we call the Cajun Navy. And they showed up at the verge of the flood, and the National Guard said, "Oh no, you're not allowed to go in." And they said, "No, we're going to save people's lives." So they went in, and they threw decorum under the bus, and the rule book didn't play, and they went in and helped people off roofs.
I think of those. I'll put it this way: 3 juvenile delinquents who. I will cry telling the story, stole those school buses and just loaded them with people and drove to Houston. It was one of those people who are written off, I guess, in some respects, who aren't, the structure or the power in place, and yet had the opportunity to decide what to do.
It was really dark there in New Orleans. I went back about the same time, about 6 weeks after, and there was all this National Guard, and I remember being in this cafe one night. There weren't many open, and on Maple Street, and there were these uptown white people who seemed rather pleased. This was their opportunity to clean the city up, and I say they were given. There were lots of survivors given one-way tickets. Yeah. And they, either found a better life in Houston or Salt Lake City.
I was going to say the Utah one was puzzling, but yeah.
Or they were unable to find their way back. And so I was at a nation dinner in December after Katrina, and was introduced to Alice Waters, who said she wanted to, the founder of Chez Panisse in Berkeley, and she said she wanted to do something for New Orleans. And I said, well, let's bring your edible schoolyard. And so we did that, and it's been hugely successful. So, with my foundation, I've had some role in the rebuilding in education mostly, and the arts. But like 6 months later, like in April, she came to town to talk about the founding of Edible Schoolyard, this interdisciplinary, hands-on learning thing. She was a Montessori teacher before she was a culinarian.
Didn't know that.
So it's a learn by doing thing. And so I gave her the misery tour. So we were in the lower Ninth Ward, and she said, "Randy, why isn't this fixed?" I said, "Alice, it's the 7 Manhattans were underwater.
Yeah.
7 Manhattans. So, there's still areas that haven't come back. And in many ways, New Orleans is very vital. There's a lot of building, not all of it good. The school systems, totally charter, but not the charter schools that you see around the world. It's more about dealing with inner city kids in a smart way. So, New Orleans is an improvisation. It's always been an improvisation. But I talk about that. New Orleans was a Cartesian city. It was a grid, 1718.
Yeah.
And but the enslaved population were given that area just beyond the grid, which is now called Congo Square. But even though it's called a square, it manifested as circles, drum circles, dance circles, singing circles. And so it was circles versus squares. And I think that's their circles are a throwing the grid under the bus, throwing Descartes under the bus.
That's a few blocks south of here. Once you get below 14th Street and the lines start getting weird and diagonal and curving. And
I published a piece in an urban site called Common Edge, and it starts with the grid and the New Orleans grid versus Congo Square, and then it gets into Speedy Levitch. Do you know this?
No.
Wonderful. There's a wonderful documentary about this guy, Speedy Levitch. He was a Gray Line tour. Is that the name of the bus thing? Yeah. And he's called Speedy because he talks fast, and he's not a big fan of the grid. And nor is Jane Jacobs,
Sure.
And so I weave all that together. And Speedy Levitch talks about meeting this, he makes a distinction between the what's he call it, the flow versus. Well, anyway, so he meets this well turned out woman from across the river. Pardon me, and she says, everybody loves the grid, and he says, well, what about that guy up on 27th Street that I saw under a comforter on the street? You think he likes the grid? So, and of course, Robert Moses loved the grid.
Yeah.
So
a man who never drove.
That's right.
Yeah,
but
didn't know how to drive, but decided he was going to realign this entire city for traffic.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So we'll get back to our hot cognition and try to understand through a little more experience, I guess.
Are you listening to the 99%?
The joke is I never listen to any other podcast because I'm too goddamn busy with mine and the day job. But I've always heard great stuff about it.
He's like 2-hour long episodes with some. I think he's a comedian, but the guy's obsessed with Moses and the power broker.
Yeah.
And they are going chapter by chapter. And it's hilarious and brilliant.
Yeah. Supposedly, there's still another 1,000 pages that were cut. When we talk about how you cut from 450 to 200, apparently that 1,100-page version you have there is only, I think, actually about a third. I think it's about 3,000 pages.
Yeah. But you know the odd thing about it? James Jacobs, who was Moses' most important competitor or antagonist, is not mentioned once. No. Not mentioned once.
Which, again, there's 2,000 other pages that maybe she played more role in.
So,
But yeah, it's a remarkable book. And Caro is one of my white whales who I know I'll never get on the show, but I still keep on my little list of people I'd love to get.
I heard him at a literary festival. He was great. And then there's the LBJ stuff.
Yeah.
I haven't read the new one.
There was I haven't read any of them yet because I'm waiting to make sure he finishes them, which I once stupidly said online like 15 years ago. A day later, his wife left a comment on my blog with, "Don't worry, Robert's in great health. Everything's wonderful." And I'm like, okay, I didn't mean to imply your husband's going to die. Flattering. I'm so sorry. But anyway, Randy, thanks so much for coming on the show. And thank you for winging it, for giving us a new framework, not only to see, how we see the world and how we approach stuff, but what the more malevolent forces in our day-to-day lives are actually doing to us. So a very worthwhile book, and I'm very thankful you're able to make time with all the travel that you've got to sit down with me.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And that was Randy Fertel. Go get Winging It, Improv's Power and Peril in the Age of Trump, out now from Spring Publications. And check out Randy's site, fertel.com, Fertel, for more about the book, his study of improv and spontaneity, and the appearances and conversations he's having for the book, because he's having an awful lot of good talks about this whole subject. You should also check him out on Instagram at rfertel, all one word, where he posts some really great stuff from this tour and has some really interesting thoughts on improv and spontaneity, as well as Jazz Fest. He's got some great stuff from there. But he's also on Twitter and Facebook as rfertel, same as Instagram. I'm not on either of those platforms, so I don't know what he posts there. But I'll have links to all of that in the show and episode notes for this one. And he gave me his previous books after we recorded. I'll report back on those sometime. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show by telling other people about it. Let them know there's this podcast comes out every week with really interesting conversations with fascinating people. You can also help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, or who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by email, by DM if we're connected on Instagram, by postcard or letter. My mailing address is at the bottom of the email newsletter that I send out twice a week, or by calling my Google Voice number. And that's 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So you go longer than that, you'll get cut off. Just call back and leave another message. Oh, and let me know if it would be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to share with listeners, but I'd never run something like that in a show without the speaker's permission. So, let me know. Now, if you got money to spare, don't give it to me. I am going to ask you for money later this year for a Kickstarter for the weird book that I'm making. But don't give me anything before then. Give money to other people or other institutions and help other people in need. When it comes to individuals, you can go through like GoFundMe, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, Crowdfunder, all sorts of those crowdfunding platforms where you can help people with making rent or medical bills or veterinary bills, car payments, all sorts of things they might be stuck in a bind and you can really help them out with. Now, with institutions, I give to my local food bank every month, as well as the World Central Kitchen, the Jose Andres NGO that helps people in crisis zones and helps feed people. But there are other things you can do with your money. There are freedom funds, election funds, Planned Parenthood, Women's Choice. There's all sorts of things you can do if you've got a little money to spare to help build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth. used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/May4th. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.